There is something that most people never think about when they imagine surviving a brutal winter. They think about firewood. They think about wool blankets and the thickness of their walls. They think about how many cords they managed to split before the first hard freeze and whether the stove in the middle of the room will hold through the night. They think about all of it, every piece of it, and they believe that if they have enough of these things, they will be fine. But here is what they never think about, and this is the thing that killed people by the hundreds across the Northern Territories during the winter of 1886. They never think about the ground beneath their feet. They never think about what the earth itself can do when a human being is wise enough or desperate enough to ask it for help. This is the story of a woman who asked, and the earth answered. Her name was Maren Erickson. In the autumn of 1884, she was 63 years old alone and in possession of exactly 47 acres of unbroken prairie in the northeastern corner of Dakota Territory, roughly 11 miles southwest of the small settlement of Grafton. She had no husband. She had no sons. She had no farmhands, no hired help, no relatives within 100 miles who might have ridden out to check on her when the weather turned. What she had was this: two granddaughters. Solveig, aged 9, dark-haired and quiet, and already beginning to carry herself with the watchful economy of a person who has learned not to waste motion. And Britta, aged 7, who was afraid of storms and the dark and loud noises, and also on certain nights of the sound the wind made when it came across the open prairie, with nothing between it and the walls of the house but 40 miles of flat earth and the memory of grass. She had a milk cow named Sylve, 3 laying hens that had already begun to slow their production with the shortening of the days, and a debt of $62 owed to the dry goods merchant in Grafton, a man named Whitfield. Whitfield had extended her credit through the summer with the particular patience of someone who had already begun calculating what her land might be worth when she failed to repay him. He was not a cruel man. He did not raise his voice or make threats. He simply waited the way a man waits, who has seen enough widows fail on enough homesteads to know that the math in the end always works in his favor. The land itself was good land. That was not the problem. The problem was that Maren Erickson had arrived at it through grief, and grief on the Northern Plains in 1884 was not a thing that the world made room for. Her husband, Gunnar Erickson, had died of a ruptured appendix in the spring of 1883. 2 days after the pain began, one day after it became clear that no doctor could reach them in time. He was 66 years old. He had been, by every account from the neighbors who would later speak of him, with the soft reverence reserved for the recently dead, a capable man. He had built their house himself, a one-room sod structure with a wood plank floor and a single south-facing window that let in just enough light to read by on clear afternoons. He had dug the well. He had broken 16 acres of sod in their first 2 seasons on the claim. He had done all of this at an age when most men had already stopped, had already handed the work to younger hands, had already begun to sit on the porch in the afternoons and watch other people carry what they themselves could no longer lift. Gunnar had not stopped. Gunnar had kept going because that was the kind of man he was, and because stopping for a Norwegian immigrant on the Northern Plains was not a thing you did while you were still breathing. He had also been in the quiet hours after the work was done and the lamp was lit and the girls were asleep, a man who could sit across the table from Maren and say nothing for an hour and have it feel like a conversation. They had been married for 41 years. They had buried a son together. They had crossed an ocean together and then crossed half a continent, and they had arrived at this place, this 47 acres of unbroken prairie, and they had looked at it and looked at each other and decided without needing to say it out loud that this was where they would make their stand. The pain had started on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, it had moved to his right side and become something sharper, something that made him stop mid-sentence and press his hand flat against his abdomen with the careful attention of a man trying to locate something that has shifted inside him. By Thursday morning, he could not stand. Maren sent Solveig to the Björknes claim to ask Niels to ride for the doctor in Grafton, and Niels went, but the doctor was attending a birth 20 miles north, and by the time word reached him and he turned his horse south, Gunnar Erickson had been dead for 6 hours. He died on the floor of the sod house he had built on the wood planks he had laid, with his head in Maren's lap and his hand holding hers, and his last words being a request that she make sure the south pasture fence was mended before the calves came in June. He was thinking about the work. He was always thinking about the work. And then he stopped thinking about anything at all. And Maren was alone in a way that she had not been alone in 41 years, which is to say completely. And then he was gone. And Maren was left with all of it, the acres and the debt and the granddaughters and the unfinished work that stretched out in front of her like a road that simply did not end. The girls were not her daughters. They were the children of her son Eric, who had died of typhoid in Minnesota in the winter of 1881, and his wife who had followed him into the ground 6 weeks later, leaving two small girls with no one in the world except a grandmother who was already by the standards of the frontier old. Maren had taken them without hesitation. She had taken them the way you take a breath. Not because you decided to, but because the alternative was something you could not survive. The neighbors, such as they were, did not expect her to stay through the winter. The Björknes family held the claim a mile and a half to the east. Niels Björknes was a broad-shouldered man of 44, with a thick beard that he kept trimmed close to his jaw and a way of speaking that was direct without being unkind. He had 4 children of his own and a wife named Sigrid, who was known in the small community for her practicality and her refusal to waste words on sentimentality. Niels came to Maren's yard in September of 1884. He stood at the edge of the fence line with his hat in his hands, the way a man stands when he has come to say something he believes is necessary but does not enjoy saying. "There is no shame in it," he told her. "A woman at your age alone with 2 children, this far out with what is coming. There is no shame in going back to Minnesota. Your sister is there. The girls would be warm. You have done more than anyone could ask." Maren looked at him for a long moment. She was standing on the south side of the sod house with a shovel in her hands and dirt on her forearms, and the particular expression of a woman who has been underestimated so many times that she has stopped feeling the need to correct it. She thanked him for his concern. She did not go. Niels Björknes walked back to his claim that afternoon with the uneasy feeling of a man who has just watched someone make a decision he cannot understand and cannot prevent. He told Sigrid that evening that the old woman was going to stay and that he supposed they would do what they could for her when the time came and that he hoped it would be enough. Sigrid said nothing. She was peeling potatoes. She had her own opinions about what Maren Eriksson was and was not capable of, but she kept them where she kept most of her opinions, which was behind her teeth and inside her own counsel. What Niels Björknes did not know, and what none of the neighbors knew, and what Maren herself had never spoken of to anyone on the Dakota Prairie was this. She was not simply a Norwegian immigrant widow with $62 of debt and too much stubbornness for her own good. She was not simply a grandmother raising 2 orphaned girls on land that most men half her age would have abandoned. She was the daughter of a man named Halvor Strand, and Halvor Strand had spent 40 years building things in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley of central Norway before immigrating to America in 1871. He had been a builder, not the ordinary kind, not the kind who puts up barns and fences and calls it a day. He had been something older and stranger and more precise than that. Halvor had learned as a young apprentice under a master builder named Olav Gresseth, a technique so old and so practical that it had simply been forgotten by the people who no longer needed it. He had built root cellars, not the shallow afterthought kind that every farmer digs for his turnips and expects nothing more from than a place to keep things cool. He had built deep living cellars, structures designed not just to store vegetables, but to sustain human life in conditions that would kill a man in an open room above ground. He had learned the principle from Gresseth, who had learned it from the men who built the old Norwegian stabber storage houses centuries before, and those men had learned it from an understanding of the earth that was older still. The earth below the frost line maintains a temperature of between 40 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air above it is doing. In a Norwegian winter, that difference between the frozen surface and the living earth below it is the difference between dying and surviving. It is not a large difference in terms of numbers. It is the largest difference in the world in terms of what it means. Halvor Strand had built 3 such structures in his lifetime in Norway. He had understood them the way a shipwright understands the hull of a vessel, not as a collection of measurements, but as a living system, a thing that breathes and holds and gives back what the earth has stored. And he had taught Maren everything. The last time she had seen her father alive was in the summer of 1880. He was 61 years old and still strong in his hands and his shoulders, but beginning to move with the deliberate care of a man who has stopped taking his body for granted. His knees troubled him. His eyes were not what they had been, but his mind was a cathedral, and the knowledge inside it was the work of a lifetime. He had sat with her at the kitchen table in their farmhouse outside St. Paul on a warm afternoon in July, and he had drawn for her on a folded sheet of brown paper the cross-section of an underground chamber, the way an engineer might draw a bridge, with measurements, with notes, with small arrows indicating the direction of airflow through a ventilation shaft and the path of thermal radiation from the bare earth floor upward into the living space. He had drawn it carefully with the patience of a man who knows he is transferring something that cannot be replaced. The main chamber, he told her, should be 8 feet deep from surface grade, 10 feet long, 7 feet wide. The walls cut clean and vertical into the subsoil. The ceiling formed by laying 6-inch round timbers across the full width, then covering those timbers with 12 inches of loose straw, then covering the straw with 18 inches of tamped earth. The floor left bare. No wood, no stone, no insulating material of any kind. Bare earth so that the thermal mass of the ground itself could radiate upward into the space. One ventilation shaft 4 inches in diameter, angled at 45 degrees from the ceiling to the surface, positioned so that the prevailing wind would draw stale air out through the Venturi effect rather than forcing cold air in. The wind moving across the opening would create a zone of low pressure at the shaft's mouth, pulling air upward through the tube the way a chimney pulls smoke. In still conditions, the natural convection of the warmer air inside the chamber would create sufficient upward draft to maintain ventilation on its own. One entrance, a trapdoor framed with 2-inch planks fitted with leather hinges and covered when closed with a thin layer of dirt and wood chips that would make it indistinguishable from the floor around it. He had looked at her across the table when he was finished drawing, and he had said the thing that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The earth does not betray you, Marin. Not if you go deep enough. Everything above the surface can fail. The stove can crack, the walls can buckle, the wood can run out, but the earth at 8 feet holds its warmth the way a mother holds a child. It does not let go. He had folded the brown paper and given it to her. He had died 4 months later, in the autumn of 1880, quietly in his sleep with his tools still hanging on the wall of his workshop and his hands still calloused from the last thing he had built. Marin had kept the paper. She had kept it through the move to Dakota, through the death of her son, through the death of her husband, through everything that the world had taken from her, which was nearly all of it. She had kept it the way a person keeps a map to a place they have not yet needed to go, but know they will. And now the time had come. In the first week of October 1884, Marin Erickson began to dig. She chose her location with the precision of someone who had been planning it since spring. Not in front of the house, not in the open yard where a passing rider might see disturbed earth and ask questions. She chose the space directly beneath the footprint of the existing woodshed. The woodshed was a simple lean-to structure, 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, built against the north wall of the sod house. It had a dirt floor and a roof of rough-cut planks covered in tar paper, and it already held most of her winter wood supply, approximately 3.5 cords of cottonwood and green ash that the girls had helped her stack through September. The woodshed was invisible from the road. It faced north, which meant no passing traveler would look at it and see anything unusual. It was in every respect the most forgettable structure on the claim. That was precisely why she chose it. She began by pulling the wood stacks away from the north corner of the shed, moving them carefully, methodically, so that the outer appearance of the structure would not change. Then she started digging. The first shovelful of earth came up heavy and dark and smelling of rain that had fallen weeks ago and been held in the soil the way the earth holds everything patiently without complaint. She set it in the wheelbarrow and drove the spade in again, and again, and again. The topsoil in that part of Dakota Territory is a rich, dark loam that runs between 18 and 24 inches deep before giving way to a dense, pale subsoil of clay and fine gravel. The loam was easy. It broke apart under the blade with a soft resistance that her shoulders could manage without strain. But the subsoil was different. The subsoil was the earth saying no and meaning it, dense and compacted and heavy with minerals that had been settling into place since before anyone had thought to put a name on this territory. The clay fought every inch of the spade and released each load with a sucking reluctance that doubled the effort required to move it. She worked with a long-handled spade and a short-handled trenching shovel, and she moved the excavated earth in a wheelbarrow 63 loads in the first 3 days, piling it against the south side of the sod house, where it would look to any observer like nothing more than a woman banking her walls against the coming cold. Which in a sense it was. She dug every morning from first light until the girls needed her for the midday meal, and again in the late afternoon until the light failed. At 63, her body did not respond the way it had at 30 or even at 50. Her lower back seized on the third morning a sudden white bolt of pain that locked her in place at the bottom of the hole, with her hands on the shovel handle and her teeth clenched and her eyes closed, waiting for it to pass. It passed. She kept digging. Her hands blistered on the second day. The blisters broke on the third. The raw skin beneath them wept fluid that mixed with the clay dust and formed a pale crust on her palms that cracked open every time she gripped the shovel. She wrapped her hands in strips of old cotton sheeting and kept going. Her knees swelled. Her shoulders ached in a way that woke her at night when she turned over. Her right hip, which had troubled her since a fall on the ice 2 winters before, sent a thin line of pain down her thigh with every step she took on the ladder she had built, from scrap lumber to climb in and out of the deepening hole. She was not complaining, she was calculating. Every morning before she descended into the pit, she stood at the edge and looked at what she had done and what remained to be done, and she divided the remaining work into units she could manage. Not by strength, by technique, by the precise angle of the shovel that moved the most earth with the least effort, by the rhythm of dig and lift and turn and dump that she had refined over 3 days until it was as smooth and automatic as breathing. She was not young, but she was not foolish. And there is a difference between strength and knowledge that the young do not always understand, which is that strength is what you use when you do not know any better, and knowledge is what you use when your body can no longer afford the luxury of ignorance. Maren Eriksson knew things. She knew the angle. She knew the rhythm. She knew how deep to cut and where to place her feet, and how to use the weight of the earth itself to break it loose rather than fighting it with brute force. And she knew something else, something she had not told anyone and did not intend to. On the morning of the fourth day, Solveig appeared at the edge of the pit. The girl stood there in her worn dress and her 2 large boots looking down at her grandmother 8 feet below, and she did not say anything. She simply picked up the handles of the wheelbarrow and began to move the pile of excavated earth that Maren had left at the top of the ladder. Maren looked up. She saw the girl. She saw the thin arms and the set jaw and the expression that was not a child's expression, but something older. Something that belonged to a person who had already lost enough to know that when someone you love is doing something hard, you do not ask questions. You pick up what you can carry. Maren did not tell her to stop. She did not tell her to go back to the house. She looked at the girl for a long moment, and then she nodded once and went back to digging. They did not speak about it. They did not need to. Something had been understood between them that was older than language and more binding than any promise either of them could have made. From that morning on, Solveig moved the earth while Maren dug it. The work went faster. Not dramatically, not the way it would have gone faster with a grown man helping, but enough. Enough to matter. Britta, the younger one, watched from the doorway of the sod house with wide eyes and said nothing, because Britta was 7 and had learned that there were things happening in the adult world that she did not yet understand, but that seemed important enough to stay quiet about. On the 9th day of digging, Maren Eriksson reached the required depth of 8 feet. She stood at the bottom of the hole she had made with the shovel resting against the earthen wall beside her and her hands hanging at her sides in the particular silence of accomplishment that does not need an audience. The walls rose around her clean and vertical, cut into the pale subsoil, with a precision that would have made her father nod in quiet approval. The dimensions were correct. The depth was correct. The orientation aligned with the long axis of the woodshed above was correct. She had moved in total approximately 4.5 tons of earth. At 63 years old with a bad back and swollen knees and hands that looked like she had been fighting with the ground itself, which in a way she had. She climbed the ladder slowly that evening, one rung at a time, feeling every joint and every muscle and every year of her age in a way that was not self-pity, but simple inventory. This is what it cost. This is what I paid. This is what I have now. She cooked supper for the girls, salt pork and beans and cornbread made from the last of the meal she had ground the week before. They ate in the lamplight, the 3 of them, and Britta fell asleep at the table with her cheek on her arm, and Solveig carried her to bed without being asked. Marin sat alone at the table for a long time after the girls were asleep. She unfolded the brown paper her father had drawn on 4 years ago and spread it flat on the rough plank surface and studied it in the lamplight with the focus of a woman who is about to build something that no one around her believes she is capable of building and who does not care because the opinion of people who have never been 8 feet underground in a Dakota winter is not a thing she has any use for. Outside, the first stars of October burned cold and steady over the prairie. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. Somewhere to the east on the Björknes claim, a light still burned in the window, and Nils Björknes was probably telling his wife that the winter was going to be hard this year, and that he hoped the old woman next door would come to her senses before it was too late. Marin folded the paper and put it back inside the lining of her coat where she had carried it for 3 years. Then she went to bed. Her back ached in a way she could feel in her teeth when she turned over in the dark. She lay still and waited for it to settle, and while she waited, she did what she always did in the quiet minutes before sleep. She planned. The timbers for the ceiling would be the most significant challenge. There were no 6-inch round timbers readily available on the open prairie. But there was a stand of mature cottonwood along a creek that ran through the Björknes claim. Niels had told her in the spring she was welcome to cut deadfall from that stand. He had said it casually, the way a man offers a small kindness to someone he expects will be gone by winter. She would need 7 poles, each roughly 8 feet long. She would need to haul them 3 miles round trip using Sylv the cow as her draft animal. She would need straw for the ceiling layer. She would need lumber for the trapdoor frame. She would need to bore a ventilation shaft at precisely 45 degrees through the north wall. She would need to do all of this before the ground froze hard, which in this part of Dakota could happen any day after the middle of October. She had at most 3 weeks. The pain in her back settled into a dull warmth that she could almost ignore. She closed her eyes. 3 weeks, 7 poles, 1 trapdoor, 1 shaft. And then the winter could come, and the winter could do whatever it wanted, and it would not matter. Because 8 feet down, the cold cannot reach. Maren Eriksson slept. Outside, the temperature dropped to 29 degrees, and the first frost of the season settled over the prairie like a promise of what was coming. The timber for the ceiling presented the most significant challenge Maren faced in the entire construction. There were no 6-inch round timbers readily available on the open prairie of northeastern Dakota Territory in 1884. The lumber yards in Grafton carried milled planks and dimensional stock, but nothing of the size and shape she needed, and even if they had, she could not have purchased it without raising questions she was not prepared to answer. A 63-year-old widow buying heavy round timbers in October would have generated exactly the kind of conversation she intended to avoid. What there was, if a person knew where to find it, was a stand of mature cottonwood trees along the course of a small creek that ran through the Björknes claim to the east. The trees grew thick along the water, their trunks pale and deeply furrowed, and among them lay the deadfall of years past branches and whole trunks that had come down in storms and settled into the creek bottom, where the water had stripped their bark and hardened their wood to something close to stone. Niels Björknes had told Maren in the spring that she was welcome to cut deadfall from that stand, as he had no immediate use for it. He had said it in the offhand way that men offer small permissions to people they do not expect will make significant use of them. Take what you need for kindling, he had told her. There is plenty down there. Maren had thanked him at the time, without yet knowing precisely how she would use the permission. She knew now. She went to the creek bottom on a cold morning in the second week of October, when a hard frost had made the ground firm enough to work on without sinking to her ankles in mud. She brought the short-handled saw and the long-handled axe and a length of rope, and she walked the creek bed for an hour before she selected her timber. 7 cottonwood poles, each roughly 8 feet long and between 5 and 7 inches in diameter. Not perfect, not the uniform 6-inch rounds her father had specified in his drawings, but close enough for the earth to forgive the difference. She cut them where they lay, trimming the branches and squaring the ends with the axe, working with the steady rhythm of a woman who has swung an axe for 50 years and no longer thinks about the mechanics of it the way a younger person might. Her arms knew, her shoulders knew, her hands wrapped in their cotton strips over the raw skin beneath, knew the angle and the weight and the follow-through, and they did not need to be told. The hauling was harder. She had no horse. Gunnar had sold their horse the autumn before he died, intending to buy a younger one in the spring, a transaction that the spring had not allowed him to complete. What Marin had was Sylve, a milk cow, 9 years old, brown and white, placid by temperament, strong enough to pull a sled but not bred for it, and not enthusiastic about the proposition. Marin rigged a simple drag harness from rope and a section of leather strap, hitched it to Sylve, and loaded 2 poles at a time onto the flat wooden sled that Gunnar had built for hauling firewood. The round trips covered approximately 3 miles each. The cow moved at the pace of a cow, which is to say at the pace of an animal that sees no reason to hurry and will not be persuaded otherwise. She made 4 trips in 2 days. 8 poles total, one more than she needed, because her father had taught her that redundancy is not waste. Redundancy is the margin between what you plan for and what actually happens. On the morning of October 14th, she laid the 7 best cottonwood poles across the width of the chamber, setting each one into notches she had cut into the subsoil walls at the required depth. Each pole rested with its full surface against the earth, locked into its notch so that it could not shift or roll. She tested each one by standing on it, her full weight centered on the middle of the span, feeling for flex, feeling for give. They held. She packed the gaps between the poles with strips of old burlap sacking soaked in water and allowed to freeze solid overnight. Her father had called this technique frost mortar. It was simple and effective and entirely temporary, which was the point. The frozen burlap would hold through the winter, sealing the gaps against air infiltration and providing a base for the insulating layer above. In the spring, when the ground warmed and the frost mortar thawed, it could be cleared away without damaging the timbers, inspected and replaced. Over the poles she laid her straw, the last of a bale she had intended for Sylve's winter bedding, supplemented with dry grass she had cut from the low ground near the creek, spreading it in an even layer across the full ceiling surface to a depth of 14 inches. 2 inches more than her father had specified. Because she was building for conditions he had understood in theory, but she would experience in fact, and because that she had learned in over 63 years of living that when the margin is between comfortable and dead, you do not round down. Over the straw, she replaced the excavated earth, tamping each layer with the flat back of her spade and the heel of her boot. Layer by layer, 6 inches at a time, tamped firm, then another layer tamped again. When she was finished, the surface of the woodshed floor above the chamber was elevated by approximately 8 inches from its original grade. Barely noticeable. Easily explained by settling and debris accumulation, which is what every dirt floor does over time, whether anyone builds anything under it or not. She spread wood chips over the disturbed area and restacked her wood supply on top of it. That forgettable lean-to she had chosen precisely for its invisibility looked exactly as it had looked before. A simple structure full of firewood, a thing no one would look at twice. She framed the trap door on October 17th. The frame was 2x6 lumber she had purchased in Grafton in August, ostensibly for repairing the house floor. A purchase that had raised no comment at the store because it was exactly the kind of thing a widow with a deteriorating homestead might reasonably buy. The clerk had made a note of it in the ledger and moved on to the next customer, and Marin had loaded the lumber onto the sled and driven Sylve home through the August heat with the boards that would become the entrance to a structure that no one in Grafton would know about for 2.5 years. The door itself was 2 pieces of the same lumber, face-nailed together for thickness and rigidity, with a recessed pull ring made from a bent nail and a short length of harness leather. The ring sat flush with the surface of the door when released, leaving no protrusion, no visible hardware, nothing that a foot moving across the floor would catch on or detect. She fitted the door into its frame with leather hinges cut from an old piece of harness strap. The hinges were silent. They did not creak. They did not bind. They moved with the oiled smoothness of leather that has been worked and worked again until it has forgotten how to resist. When she closed the door and scattered the dirt and wood chips across its surface, it disappeared. Completely. Absolutely. There was no seam visible. There was no change in the texture of the floor. There was nothing to indicate that the ground beneath a person's feet was not ground at all, but a door into a space that went down 8 feet into the living earth. She tested it 6 times before she was satisfied. She walked across it. She stamped on it. She knelt down and ran her fingers across the surface with her eyes closed, feeling for any irregularity, any ridge, any give that might betray the presence of the frame beneath? Nothing. On the seventh test, she called Solveig into the woodshed and told her to walk from one end to the other. The girl did twice her boots, moving across the dirt floor with the unself-conscious certainty of a child who has no reason to believe the ground will do anything other than hold her up. Solveig did not detect it. Maren watched her walk across the door and felt something settle inside her chest that was not pride exactly, but was close to it. The thing worked. The door was invisible, and the space beneath it was waiting. The ventilation shaft she bored on October 19th using a long-handled auger she had borrowed from the Bjerknes farm. She had told Niels Bjerknes that she needed it to bore drainage holes through the base of her water trough, which was true enough and which she did in fact use it for before returning it. She was not a woman who lied easily or often, but she understood the practical difference between a lie and an incomplete truth, and she had no moral difficulty with the latter when the alternative was explaining something that the listener was not prepared to understand. The shaft ran at 45 degrees through the earth from the chamber ceiling to the surface outside the woodshed's north wall, emerging 6 inches above ground level, angled so that its opening faced slightly downward and was partially shielded by the base of the woodshed wall from direct wind impact. She tested the principle her father had explained to her 4 years ago at that kitchen table, a lit candle held at the base of the shaft inside the chamber. The flame bent steadily inward toward the shaft, a thin tongue of fire leaning into the draw, with the quiet certainty of something that is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The draft was working. The air in the chamber would circulate. The space would breathe. Before sealing the trap door for the first time, Maren stored inside the chamber everything she and the girls would need to survive an extended period underground. Provisions enough for 3 weeks, dried beans, cornmeal, a slab of salt pork and oilcloth, preserved vegetables in sealed glass jars, a tin of lard, 2 wool blankets, a change of heavy clothing for each of the 3 of them, matches, candles, the small oil lantern with 2 full pints of lamp oil. And one other thing, a hand-copied set of the brown paper drawings her father had made traced by her own hand onto fresh paper so that the originals would not be risked in the damp of the underground space. And his letter. The last one he had written her in the summer of 1880, a few months before he died. She did not read it often. She did not need to. She had memorized it years ago the way a person memorizes a prayer. Not word by word, but as a whole thing, a single object held complete in the mind. She lowered each item through the trap door on a rope one at a time and arranged them along the eastern wall of the chamber with the organization of a woman who has thought about where everything will go and why and what she will need to reach first in the dark. Then she climbed out, closed the trap door, scattered the dirt and chips across its surface, and stood in the woodshed, looking down at the floor that held a secret no one in Pembina County would know about for 2.5 years. She told no one what she had built. Not Niels Bjerknes, not Sigrid, not the other families on the scattered claims to the south and northwest. Not Whitfield when she went into Grafton in late October to pay down $14 of her debt and buy a second pair of wool stockings for Britta. Whitfield received the payment with the measured courtesy of a man adjusting his calculations. $14 reduced the balance to $48. He recorded it in his ledger and looked at Maren over the top of the book with an expression that was not hostile but was not warm either. It was the expression of a man who has seen this arithmetic before. A small payment in the autumn, a smaller payment in the spring if there is one, and then the silence that comes when the payments stop and the land becomes available. He walked her to the door of his store and stood on the wooden sidewalk and watched her climb onto the sled and guide Sylv out of town, and then he went back inside and did what men like Whitfield always do, which is nothing visible, nothing aggressive, nothing that could be called unfair. He simply waited. On that same visit to Grafton, Whitfield mentioned that he might ride out to the homestead before winter set in to have a look at the property and assess its general condition. He said it in the conversational tone of a man discussing the weather. Maren understood exactly what he meant. He was coming to evaluate the land he expected to own by spring. She told him he was welcome anytime. Her voice was steady. Her face gave nothing away. And when she drove Sylv out of Grafton that afternoon, she did not look back. Whitfield came on the last day of October. He arrived on horseback in the late morning, dismounted at the fence line, and spent 40 minutes walking the property with the unhurried attention of a man measuring something he believes will soon be his. He looked at the sod house. He looked at the barn such as it was. He looked at the condition of the fence posts and the depth of the well and the quality of the hay that Marin had managed to put up for the winter. He walked past the woodshed. He glanced at it the way a man glances at a pile of firewood, which is to say without interest, without curiosity, without the slightest suspicion that the dirt floor beneath 3.5 cords of cottonwood and ash concealed a trapdoor leading to an 8-foot deep chamber that a 63-year-old woman had dug with her own hands in 9 days. He walked directly over the trapdoor, his boots pressed into the scattered wood chips and loose dirt. He did not pause. He did not look down. He was thinking about acreage values and crop yields and the timeline of a widow's financial collapse, and he was not thinking about the ground beneath his feet. No one ever does. Marin watched him from the doorway of the house with Britta behind her skirt and Solveig standing at the corner of the building with an expression that was for a 9-year-old remarkably close to contempt. Whitfield left an hour later. He told Marin to take care of herself through the winter. He said it with the solicitude of a man who hopes she will not. She said nothing because she understood with the particular clarity that comes from having watched people dismiss her father's ideas throughout his entire life, that the surest way to undermine a thing that works is to explain it to someone who has not yet seen it work. She would wait. The winter would explain it better than she ever could. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was cold but not catastrophic. The temperatures dropped steadily through November and December, and the snow came in regular intervals, building a white surface over the prairie that reflected the low winter sun and made the air feel colder than the thermometer said it was. Marin used the chamber twice during that first season. The first time was in late December when a 3-day blizzard drove the temperature to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sod house became genuinely dangerous. The walls held, but the stove could not keep pace with the cold that pressed inward from every surface, and by the second morning the temperature inside the house at table height was 31 degrees and falling. She moved the girls into the chamber without ceremony, without drama, without any explanation beyond telling them that this was what their great-grandfather had taught her to do, and that it was safe and that they were going to be perfectly warm. Solveig, who was practical by nature and had already decided that her grandmother was a person worth trusting without conditions, accepted this. Britta wept. She wept for approximately 40 minutes, a thin, frightened crying that echoed off the earthen walls of the chamber and filled the small space with the particular sound of a child who is afraid of something she cannot name. And then she fell asleep on the warm earth floor, wrapped in a wool blanket with her face pressed against the ground, and she slept undisturbed for 11 hours. When Marin held the thermometer at chest height in the middle of the chamber on the coldest night of that December storm, it read 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside above them, the wind was driving snow horizontally across the prairie at better than 40 miles per hour. The sod house creaked and groaned under the pressure. The water bucket by the stove had frozen solid. The candle on the floor of the chamber did not flicker. Not once. The second time was in late January when Marin became ill. It began as a cough, dry and persistent, the kind that settles into the chest and refuses to leave. Within 2 days it had become something worse. A deep, wet rattling in her lungs that she could hear when she lay flat, a sound like gravel rolling in a tin pail. Her temperature rose. Her body ached in a way that had nothing to do with labor and everything to do with age and cold and the accumulated fatigue of a winter spent doing the work of 3 people. She could not keep the stove fed at the rate the cold required without burning through her wood supply at a pace that would leave her short by March. The arithmetic was simple and merciless. If she stayed in the house and kept the stove at the level her illness demanded, she would run out of wood 6 weeks before spring. She moved herself and the girls underground for 4 days. She slept on the bare earth floor with 2 blankets over her, and the warmth of the ground beneath her radiating upward into her body like a slow, patient hand pressing heat into her bones. The fever came in waves. There were hours when she was lucid, and hours when she was not, and in the hours when she was not, the chamber around her became something else. The earthen walls became the walls of her father's workshop in St. Paul. The ceiling timbers became the rafters of the farmhouse in Norway that she had never seen but that Halvor had described to her so many times that she could walk through it in her mind with her eyes closed. The warm earth beneath her became the floor of a root cellar in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley, a place she had never been built by men she had never met, who had understood something about the ground that most people would never learn. She drifted in and out of these visions the way a person drifts in and out of sleep, not fully in either world, aware enough to know that Solveig was checking on her every hour, bringing water, adjusting the blanket, watching her grandmother's face with an expression that was not panic but was close to it. The controlled alertness of a child who is doing her best to manage a situation that is larger than she is. Britta sat in the far corner with her knees drawn up quiet for once, not crying, watching with wide eyes that understood something was wrong, even if she could not name what it was. And here in the fever and the darkness and the steady warmth of the chamber, a thought came to Marin that she had not allowed herself to think before. If she died, the girls would not know how to survive. Solveig was 9. She was capable and steady, and she could do the daily work of keeping alive the feeding and the fire and the water. But she did not know what the chamber was, not really. She did not know why it worked. She did not know how to maintain it, how to check the ventilation, how to read the signs that the ceiling timbers were taking too much weight or that the frost mortar needed replacing. She did not know the principles. She knew the place, but not the knowledge. And without the knowledge, the place was just a hole in the ground. Marin lay in the darkness of the chamber with her lungs rattling and the warm earth pressing against her back, and she felt for the first time since Gunnar had died something close to fear. Not fear of death. She had made her peace with that years ago. Fear of waste. Fear that the knowledge her father had given her, the knowledge that had traveled from Olav Griseth's hands through Halvor Strand's mind, and into hers would die in this chamber with her, and leave 2 small girls alone on the surface with nothing but a hole they did not understand. That was the fear that moved her more than any blizzard ever could. Marin recovered. The fever broke on the 3rd night, and by the 4th morning, she was sitting up, drinking broth, and feeling the particular clarity that comes after illness, when the body reasserts itself and the mind suddenly unfogged, sees everything with painful precision. She made a decision. She would teach Solveig everything. By the spring of 1885, Marin was the only homesteader within a 6-mile radius who had not lost at least one animal to the cold. The Björknes family had lost 2 pigs and a calf. Arvid Grindal, a Norwegian bachelor who held the claim 3 miles to the northwest, had lost 7 of his 8 sheep when a sudden temperature drop in February caught him without sufficient bedding straw, and his barn roof partially collapsed under the snow load. A newer family, the Holmgrens, who had arrived from Wisconsin the previous spring and built a small frame house with walls only 4 inches thick, had spent the last 6 weeks of winter living with the Björknes family after their stove cracked, and they burned through their remaining firewood trying to compensate. None of them knew about the chamber under Marin's woodshed. None of them thought to ask how she had managed so well. What they thought, and this is the thing that people decide when they cannot explain a woman's competence, and especially an old woman's competence, was that she had been lucky. Niels Björknes said as much to Sigrid, who repeated it to the Holmgren woman, who mentioned it to Marin herself one afternoon in April, in the tone of friendly informing that is a community's way of letting you know what it has decided about you. Marin had been lucky. The winter had not been so bad, really. She had managed. It was good that she had managed. The general sense was that this had been a special circumstance, and that the next winter or the one after would demonstrate that a woman of her age alone on 47 acres with 2 small children was not a sustainable arrangement. They were kind about it. They said it with smiles and gentle nods and the particular softness that people reserve for someone they have already decided is failing, even when the evidence says otherwise. That almost made it worse. In the summer of 1885, Marin expanded the chamber. She dug a secondary alcove off the eastern wall 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, connected to the main space by a low-arched opening that required an adult to duck slightly to pass through. This alcove she fitted as a stable annex with a low wooden manger built against its far wall and the floor covered in a 6-inch layer of clean sand over the bare earth. Her father's notes had described how the original builders of these structures in Norway had routinely integrated small livestock into the underground shelter during extreme cold, the animals providing additional body heat that could raise the chamber temperature by as much as 15 degrees. Sylv the cow was too large, but the 3 hens were not. She built a small hinged crate for them that could be lowered through the trap door on a rope. She added a second ventilation shaft in the alcove mirroring the angle of the first and cut a second smaller trap door in the woodshed floor immediately above the alcove opening. And she built the thing her father had described, but which she had not included in the initial construction because she had not had the time or the materials. A thermal flywheel, the term was entirely Halvor Strand's own invention, not found in any book Maren had ever seen. But the principle behind it was as old as the stone itself. Along the western wall of the main chamber, she stacked 47 river stones, each weighing between 8 and 20 pounds, collected over 3 separate wagon trips to the creek bed on the Björknes claim. She arranged them in an interlocking pattern against the wall, building a stack roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet deep, leaving approximately 2 feet of working space between the stone mass and the center of the chamber. Her father had understood something that most people of that era had not thought to articulate. Dense stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it even more slowly. A mass of stone maintained at ground temperature for months will continue to radiate that stored thermal energy for hours after the air temperature around it has dropped. In practical terms, this meant that if Maren heated the chamber with the oil lantern for 2 or 3 hours before retreating to it in an emergency, the stone wall would hold and release that warmth for the following 12 to 18 hours with no additional fuel required. She tested this on a cold October morning in 1885. She lit the lantern inside the chamber and let it burn for 2 hours, heating the air and the stone wall simultaneously. Then she extinguished it, sealed the trap door, and left. When she returned 12 hours later and descended into the chamber with the thermometer in her hand, the reading at chest height was 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 14 degrees above zero and dropping. She climbed out, closed the trap door, walked to the house, and started cooking supper. She did not celebrate. She did not tell anyone. She simply noted the number and stored it in the same place she stored everything that mattered, which was inside her own mind, where it would be ready when she needed it. That same autumn, she began teaching Solveig. Not casually, not in the scattered incidental way that knowledge often passes between generations, half remembered and poorly understood. She taught her deliberately, systematically, the way Halvor Strand had taught her. She brought the girl into the chamber on a warm September afternoon when the trapdoor stood open and the light fell down through the shaft in a pale column that illuminated the earthen walls and made the space feel less like a shelter and more like a classroom. She spread the brown paper drawings on the floor and knelt beside them and waited for Solveig to kneel beside her, and then she began. She explained the principles one at a time, making Solveig repeat them back until the girl could say them in her own words. The frost line and what it means. The thermal mass of the earth and why it matters that the floor is bare. The reason the ventilation shaft is angled at 45 degrees and not drilled straight up, and what would happen if it were straight, which is that cold air would fall directly into the chamber, like water pouring down a well, and the entire system would fail. She explained the stone wall. Why river stone and not fieldstone? Why the interlocking pattern matters? Why the mass needs to be at least 3 feet deep before it begins to function as a true thermal reservoir. She explained what her father had meant by the term thermal flywheel, which was his way of describing a body of stone that absorbs heat so slowly and releases it so slowly that it functions as a kind of mechanical memory, holding the warmth of last Tuesday and releasing it on Thursday, holding the warmth of a 2-hour lantern burn and releasing it over the following 12 hours. She taught her how to test the draw of the ventilation shafts with a candle flame, how to inspect the ceiling timbers for signs of stress, checking for bowing at the center of the span and cracks in the frost mortar joints, how to read the thermometer and what the numbers meant, how to calculate how long the oil would last at a given burn rate, how to seal the trap door and how to open it, and how to know from the sound of the wind above whether it was safe to go up. She taught her something else too, something that was not in the drawings and not in the measurements and not in any of the technical principles her father had articulated. She taught her the reason for secrecy, not the practical reason, which was obvious. The deeper reason, which was this, that the world does not easily accept competence from people it has decided are incompetent, and that the surest protection for a thing that works is to let it prove itself before exposing it to the opinions of people who have already made up their minds. Solveig understood this. She understood it the way she understood everything her grandmother told her, which was immediately and completely, and without the need for repetition. She was 10 years old, and she had already learned from watching the way the neighbors looked at her grandmother and the way they talked about her when they thought no one was listening, that the world has a limited imagination when it comes to old women. Solveig listened the way she did everything. quietly, completely, with the focus of a child who understands that what she is being given is not information, but inheritance. By the end of that autumn, Solveig could run the chamber on her own. She was 10 years old. She was the second person alive who understood how the structure worked and why. 4 generations of knowledge, from Olav Grayseth to Halvor Strand to Maren Eriksson to Solveig. An unbroken line of understanding that had traveled from the valleys of central Norway to the open prairie of Dakota Territory, carried not in books or institutions, but in the hands and minds of people who built things that worked and taught other people to build them too. What happened in the autumn of 1886 was not at first recognized for what it was. The summer had been dry and unusually warm across the northern plains. The range cattle were in poor condition from overstocking and sparse grass. The old-timers, those who paid attention to the signs that the earth gives when it is about to do something severe, noticed that the squirrels were caching more aggressively than usual, that the muskrats had built their lodges unusually thick and high, that the early migrating birds had left 2 full weeks ahead of schedule. Maren noticed all of these things and more. She noticed that the ground froze hard in the first week of November, 3 weeks earlier than the year before. She noticed that the first November snowfall, which came on the 13th, left a crust that did not melt and did not soften. She noticed the quality of the cold itself, the way it pressed against the walls of the sod house, with a weight that was different from ordinary winter cold, heavier, more patient, more deliberate, as if the atmosphere itself were settling in for something it intended to sustain for a very long time. She began in the second week of November to make quiet, methodical preparations. She moved an additional 30 pounds of dried provisions into the chamber. She refilled the lamp oil tin to capacity. She brought in a 48 stone from the creek bed, a flat piece of dark shale that she wedged into the top tier of the thermal wall. She re-examined every joint in the ceiling timbers, replacing 2 sections of frost mortar that had cracked over the summer with fresh packed clay. She moved the hen crate into the alcove permanently. She told no one what she was doing. She told no one what she expected, but Solveig knew. The girl watched her grandmother's preparations with the quiet attention of someone who has been taught to read the signs, and one evening in mid-November, standing in the woodshed beside the closed trapdoor, she looked at Maren and asked the only question that mattered. "It is going to be bad this time, is it not?" Maren looked at her granddaughter in the thin light of the November dusk and answered with the specific honesty she reserved for people she respected, which was a category that had over the years grown very small. "Yes," she said, "I believe it is." Solveig nodded. She did not cry. She did not ask what they were going to do because she already knew. She had been taught. She had been prepared. She was 10 years old and she understood the chamber and the principles behind it, and the reason her grandmother had spent 2 years building something that the entire community believed was unnecessary, because the entire community believed that Maren Eriksson had simply been lucky. They were about to find out what luck had nothing to do with. The first serious storm of that winter came on November 17, 1886. It was not the worst storm of the season. It was not the storm that would break the back of the northern plains and kill cattle by the tens of thousands and freeze men solid on roads they had walked 100 times before. It was only the first signal, the opening statement of a winter that had no intention of being brief. 3 days of temperatures that never rose above minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds steady out of the northwest at between 25 and 35 miles per hour, driving the snow not downward but sideways horizontal sheets of white that erased the horizon and turned the space between the sod house and the woodshed into a blind corridor of noise and cold. The wind chill, though that term was not yet in common use, produced conditions equivalent to minus 50 degrees or lower on any exposed surface. Maren kept herself and the girls in the sod house for the first day of that storm. She fed the stove carefully, splitting each piece of wood into smaller sections to control the burn rate, monitoring her supply with the practiced arithmetic of a woman who has learned to count every stick, every knot, every hour of heat a given piece of cottonwood will yield before it turns to ash. On the second day, the temperature inside the house at mid-morning was 38 degrees. The stove was consuming wood at a rate she calculated would exhaust her above-ground supply in another 20 hours. She made the decision without drama, without ceremony, without the kind of anguished deliberation that stories sometimes give to their characters in order to make a moment feel more important than it is. There was no deliberation because there was nothing to deliberate. The arithmetic was clear, and the solution was already built and waiting 8 feet below the floor of the woodshed. She told the girls to put on their heaviest wool. She tied a rope from the house door to the woodshed door, 12 feet of lifeline, in a blizzard that could kill a person who wandered 10 feet off course. She opened the house door into the screaming wind, held Britta's hand in her left and Solveig's in her right, and they crossed the 12 feet of open ground. In under a minute, the rope sliding through Marin's grip as they moved the snow, hitting the side of her face like thrown sand. Inside the woodshed, the wind dropped to a dull roar against the walls. Marin pulled the door shut, knelt on the dirt floor and swept away the wood chips and loose earth with her bare hands until the pull ring of the trapdoor emerged. She hooked her finger through it and lifted. The warm air rose out of the chamber like a breath. She lowered Britta first, then Solveig, then climbed down herself, pulling the trapdoor shut above her and sliding the wooden locking bar into place across its underside with a sound that was quiet and final and meant that whatever the world above them wanted to do for the next 72 hours was no longer her concern. The temperature in the chamber when they entered was 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Cooler than it had been in October, but 2 degrees warmer than the standard ground temperature at that depth, which told Marin that the thermal wall was already doing its slow, patient work, radiating the heat it had been absorbing from the earth since she had first stacked those 47 river stones against the western wall more than a year ago. She lit the lantern. She hung it from a bent nail driven into one of the ceiling timbers. The light filled the chamber with a warm orange glow that softened the rough earthen walls and made the small space feel less like a hole in the ground and more like what it actually was. A room. A room that worked. A room that held. She settled herself against the stone wall with a wool blanket across her shoulders and Britta's head in her lap. The girl was trembling not from cold, but from the transition from the strangeness of being underground while the world above howled and shook. Britta looked up at her grandmother's face in the lantern light and asked the question she always asked. "Are we going to be all right?" Marin looked down at her. She smoothed the girl's hair back from her forehead with her rough, calloused hand, and she said yes. Not the way people say yes when they are hoping, not the way people say it when they are trying to convince themselves. The way people say it when they know, when the knowing is built into the walls around them and the floor beneath them and the stone at their backs that is warm to the touch because the earth has been warming it for 13 months. "Yes," she said, "we are going to be perfectly all right." Within 2 hours, the lantern had raised the chamber temperature to 57 degrees. The hens in their crate in the alcove were audibly calm, making the low murmuring sounds that hens make when they are settled and warm and not inclined to move. Marin extinguished the lantern to conserve oil. In the darkness, the warmth held. The stone wall at her back continued to radiate. Britta's breathing slowed and deepened, and the trembling stopped, and the girl slept. Solveig sat across the chamber with her back against the eastern wall, awake, watching her face barely visible in the faint ambient glow that came from nowhere and everywhere, the way underground spaces hold light long after the source is gone. By the following morning, with no heat source other than the thermal wall and the body warmth of the three of them, the chamber temperature had dropped to exactly 50 degrees. Marin lit the lantern again. 2 hours. The temperature climbed to 55. She extinguished it. The storm above them continued for another 31 hours. They ate, they slept. They told each other the old stories that Halvor Strand had told Marin when she was young. Stories about the old builders in Norway and the root cellars carved into mountainsides, and the principle that the ground does not forget its warmth, and that a person who understands this has access to something that no amount of firewood or wool or stubbornness can replace. Britta listened with her eyes half closed, drifting in and out of sleep, absorbing the stories the way children absorb things, not through understanding, but through presence. Solveig listened the way she listened to everything, completely. When the storm broke on the afternoon of the third day, Marin climbed out through the trapdoor into the woodshed, pushed the outer door open against the packed snow, and walked to the house to assess the situation. The stove was cold, the water bucket had frozen solid, the window on the south wall had developed a new crack in the lower left corner from the stress of the wind. None of this was a problem. She restarted the stove, melted water, put on a pot of beans. The girls came up an hour later warm and entirely untroubled, and Solveig immediately went to the barn to check on Sylv. The cow was fine, cold, hungry, but alive. The barn had held. What Marin did not know yet, what none of them on the scattered claims of Pembina County knew yet, was that the storm of November 17th was only the beginning. The winter of 1886 to 1887 became in the reckoning of historians and range cattlemen and plains settlers who survived it simply the hard winter. It arrived in earnest in January of 1887 with a series of blizzards that struck in rapid succession, each one lasting between 2 and 4 days, with intervals between them of barely 48 hours. Insufficient time for temperatures to recover. Insufficient time for anyone to move significant quantities of supplies. Insufficient time for the exhausted to rest. On January 9th, a storm drove the temperature at Grafton to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit and held it there for 60 hours without meaningful interruption. The wind during the worst of that period was measured by the station agent at Grafton, a meticulous man named Caldwell, who kept a daily journal of weather conditions and local events at 47 miles per hour. Cottonwood trees split from the cold, their trunks cracking open, with sounds like rifle shots that carried across the frozen prairie for miles. The ink in Marin's pen froze solid in its inkwell inside the sod house 6 feet from the stove during the first night of that storm. A man was found frozen solid on the road between Grafton and the settlement at Forest River. He had apparently been trying to make the 2-mile journey on foot. He had not completed it. They found him standing upright in a drift, his hands still in his pockets, his face turned away from the wind, as if he had simply decided to stop walking, and the cold had taken him before he could change his mind. The Bjerknes family lost most of their firewood on the night of January 9th. The north wall of their wood storage shed, a structure Nils had built in haste the previous autumn and had intended to reinforce in the spring, buckled under the snow load and collapsed outwards, scattering their cut and split wood across an area of open yard that the blizzard immediately covered to a depth of 3 feet. In 15 minutes, the wind and snow buried a winter's worth of fuel under a frozen white surface that might as well have been concrete. Nils Bjerknes spent 4 hours in that storm trying to salvage what he could. He worked with his bare hands when his gloves became too caked with ice to grip the wood, digging through the packed snow, hauling armloads of frozen timber back to the house, making trip after trip across a yard he could barely see in conditions that no rational calculation could justify being out in. Sigrid pulled him back inside at midnight. She grabbed him by the arm and physically dragged him through the door because he would not come on his own, because Nils Bjerknes was a man who did not stop working until the work was done and could not accept that the work this time could not be done. Both of his feet were already showing the white patches that precede serious frostbite. The skin on his fingers was cracked and bleeding. He sat by the stove and stared at the wall and said nothing for a long time. By the morning of January 10th, the Bjerknes family had perhaps 6 hours of heating fuel remaining. The outside temperature was minus 31 degrees and steady. The wind had not dropped below 20 miles per hour in 18 hours. The 4 children were huddled together under every blanket in the house, and the oldest, a boy of 12, had stopped shivering, which Sigrid knew was not a good sign. Nils Bjerknes made a decision. He put on every piece of clothing he owned. He wrapped his feet in rags over his boots. He tied a horse blanket over his coat, and he walked out the door into the storm and turned west toward the Erickson claim 1.5 miles away, because there was nowhere else to go, and because the distance between going and not going was the distance between living and dying. And he chose living, even though living required walking 1.5 miles in minus 31 degrees with a wind that wanted to kill him. The first quarter mile was the worst because the wind was full in his face and the snow was driving into his eyes so hard that he could not keep them open for more than a few seconds at a time. He walked with his head turned to the side and his left hand raised in front of his face like a man warding off a blow. The cold found every gap in his clothing, every seam that was not perfectly sealed, every inch of skin that was exposed even for a moment. It found the rags around his boots and pressed through them. It found the gap between his collar and his neck where the horse blanket did not quite cover. It found the backs of his hands where the gloves had worn thin from 4 hours of digging through packed snow. He navigated by memory. He knew this 1.5 miles the way a man knows any piece of ground he has walked 100 times. He knew where the low spot was that would be drifted full. He knew where the fence line ran, though the fence itself was buried under 3 feet of snow and invisible. He knew where the creek crossing was, and he knew to stay north of it because the ice there was unpredictable, and falling through it in these conditions would be the last thing he ever did. He covered the distance in approximately 45 minutes. the last 20 of which he could not feel his toes, the last 10 of which he was navigating by instinct and memory alone because the snow had reduced visibility to less than the length of his own arm. He was moving through a white darkness, a world that had no horizon and no landmarks and no sound except the wind, which was not a sound so much as a pressure, a physical force that pushed against his body and made every step forward feel like an argument he was barely winning. He found the door of the sod house. He knocked. The sound of his fist against the wood was barely audible over the wind, a small human noise swallowed almost instantly by the roar of the storm. He knocked again harder, and then a third time, and then the door opened inward and the heat from the stove hit his face and Maren Eriksson was standing there looking at him. She was wearing her heavy wool dress and an apron, and her white hair was pulled back under a kerchief, and she looked in that moment exactly like what she was, which was a 63-year-old woman who had been expecting this knock, or one like it, for 2 years. He looked at her for a moment. This woman he had told 2 years ago to give up and go back to Minnesota. This 63-year-old widow he had pitied and worried about and privately expected to bury before spring. And he said with the specific brevity of a man who has just used most of his reserves a single sentence, "I need help." His voice cracked on the second word. Not from emotion, though there was emotion in it. From cold. His throat was raw from breathing air that was 31 degrees below zero for 45 minutes, and the words came out rough and broken and stripped of everything except their meaning. Maren did not hesitate. She did not ask questions. She did not say anything about Minnesota, or shame, or what was coming. She told him to come in and get warm. She gave him hot water. She wrapped his feet in dry wool. And then she told him to go back and bring his family. All of them, she said. Bring all of them, and bring whatever blankets you have left. Niels looked at her. He did not understand yet what she was offering, but he understood the tone of a person who has a plan, and he had no plan of his own, and that was enough. He went back. What the Björknes family found when they arrived at the Eriksson claim 2 hours later, Niels having made the return trip and the full family having made the incoming journey at a pace that allowed for the children, was not the scene of desperation they might have expected. Maren had the woodshed door standing open and a rope guide rigged from the house to the shed entrance. She had the chamber fully prepared. The lantern was lit. The stone wall had been preheated for 2 full hours. Both ventilation shafts had been tested and were drawing properly. She had the second wool blanket spread on the chamber floor, and she had moved the hens to the far corner of the alcove to make room. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready for 2 years. Niels climbed down through the trapdoor first. He stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked around the chamber in the lamplight and did not speak. His eyes moved from the earthen walls to the ceiling timbers, to the stone mass along the western wall, to the provisions stacked along the east. He was a man who built things. He understood construction. And he was standing inside something that he had not known existed 10 minutes ago, something that had been beneath the floor of a woodshed he had walked past a dozen times, something built by a woman he had advised to leave. Sigrid came next, carrying the youngest child. She descended the ladder carefully, one rung at a time, and when she stepped off the last rung and straightened up in the warm space and felt the ambient temperature wrap around her body, after 3 hours of walking in minus 30-degree conditions, she did not speak for almost a full minute. The warmth was not dramatic. It was not the blast of heat that comes from opening a stove door or stepping into a heated room. It was something quieter and more fundamental than that. It was the warmth of the earth itself rising through the bare floor and radiating from the stone wall and filling the enclosed space with a temperature that was in absolute terms only 50-some degrees, but that felt after what they had just come through like the warmth of something that had been waiting for them. Something that had been holding its heat for this exact moment, the way the earth holds everything patiently, without complaint for as long as it is needed. Sigrid turned to Maren, who had come down last and was pulling the trapdoor closed above them and sliding the locking bar into place. "How long have you had this?" "Since October of 1884, Maren said. Sigrid looked at her. She looked at the chamber walls and the ceiling timbers and the stone wall and the ventilation shaft and the stored provisions and the hens in their crate in the alcove, calm, warm, settled. She looked at all of it with the expression of a woman who is revising every assumption she has ever made about another person in the space of a single minute. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. What passed between the two women in that moment was not spoken because it did not require speech. It was the recognition of one practical woman by another. It was the acknowledgement that something had been built here, something real and solid and effective, and that the person who had built it was not lucky and had never been lucky and had been all along something else entirely, something that none of them had had the imagination to see. The chamber held 10 people for the following 72 hours. Maren and her two granddaughters, Niels and Sigrid Bjerknes and their four children. 10 people in a space 10 feet long and 7 feet wide with a 6 by 4 alcove off the eastern wall. It was not spacious. It was not comfortable in the way that comfort is usually understood, but it was warm, and warm in January of 1887 in northeastern Dakota Territory was the only thing that mattered. The lantern burned in shifts, 2 hours on 4 hours off to conserve the oil. When the lantern was lit, the temperature climbed to the mid-50s. When it was dark, the thermal wall and the body heat of 10 people held the space at 48 degrees or above. On the second evening, when all 10 of them were resting and their combined warmth was filling the enclosed space, the thermometer read 61 degrees, warmer than the sod house had been with the stove burning full. They ate Maren's provisions. They drank water from the sealed jugs she had stored against the north wall. They slept in shifts because there was not room for everyone to lie flat at once. The children slept more than the adults, which was natural. Britta slept with her head on Maren's lap the way she always did underground, and she did not cry not once because she had learned that this place was not something to fear. This place was the safest ground in Pembina County. On the second morning, the hens in the alcove laid 2 eggs. Solveig, who checked the crate each morning as part of the routine her grandmother had taught her, discovered them and carried them carefully into the main chamber and announced the fact with an expression of quiet triumph that no one who was present in that chamber ever forgot. 2 eggs, laid underground in the middle of the worst winter the northern plains had ever seen by 3 hens, who were warm and calm and doing what hens do when they are not afraid. Niels Bjerknes looked at those 2 eggs in the hands of a 10-year-old girl, and something shifted behind his eyes. Something that had been set in a certain position for a long time moved to a different position and did not move back. It was not just surprise. It was not just gratitude. It was the recognition that he had been wrong about something fundamental and that the evidence was sitting in the palms of a child who had been taught by a woman he had pitied. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. Some reckonings happen in silence, and they are no less complete for the quiet in which they occur. On January 12th, the temperature outside rose to -8 degrees, and the wind dropped to under 15 miles per hour. Not warm, not safe in the open for extended periods, but survivable. The Bjerknes family climbed out of the chamber and made the walk back to their claim to assess the damage. Their house had held, their shed had not. But they were alive, all 6 of them, and their feet were sound, and their children were fed, and the oldest boy had started shivering again, which meant his body was working properly, which meant that whatever Niels Bjerknes had expected to find at the Erickson claim when he walked out into the storm, what he had actually found was something he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for. But the hard winter was not finished. The storms continued through the second half of January and into February, one after another, with the relentless patience of something that has decided to test everything in its path. Temperatures that had not been recorded in the short history of the Grafton weather station. Winds that piled snow into drifts 15 feet deep against the sides of buildings. A sky that was white or gray or black for weeks at a time, and never during the worst of it blue. Arvid Grindal, the bachelor from the Northwest, arrived at noon on January 14th on a horse that he had kept alive during the worst of the storm by bringing it into his kitchen. He had heard through some mechanism of frontier communication that operated across even the most severe conditions that there was warmth at the Erickson place. He did not know what kind of warmth. He did not ask questions. He tied his horse to the woodshed post, climbed in through the woodshed door, found the trap door now visible because Maren had stopped concealing it during the emergency, and descended. He sat on the chamber floor for 3 hours without saying a word. The only thing he said once to no one in particular was that it was warmer underground than it had been in any house he had slept in that winter. The Holmgren family arrived the following morning, having spent the worst of the storm at the Bjerknes house, and now needing somewhere warmer than the damaged and barely habitable space they had returned to. The Holmgrens had come to Dakota from Wisconsin the previous year, full of confidence and thin walls, in a frame house that the winter had treated the way the winter treats all insufficient things, without mercy and without exception. They had spent the first hard winter storm at the Bjerknes claim crowded into a house that was itself running out of fuel, and they had seen enough to know that what they had built for themselves was not going to carry them through what was coming. Peter Holmgren was 32 years old and had the particular look of a man who has recently discovered that everything he thought he knew about surviving was wrong. He had built houses in Wisconsin. He had considered himself competent. But Wisconsin cold and Dakota cold are not the same thing, and the distance between them is measured not in degrees but in the number of people who have died learning the difference. His wife Elsa carried their infant son inside her coat and did not let go of the child for the entire descent into the chamber. When she reached the bottom and felt the warmth close around her and the baby, she sat down on the earth floor and put her face against the child's head and stayed that way for a long time. Two other families arrived in the days that followed. The Solbergs from 2 miles south, a family of 5 whose patriarch, a quiet man named Henrik, had walked through the storm with frostbitten ears and a look in his eyes that suggested he had seen something on the walk that he would not be describing to anyone. His wife carried their youngest against her chest under 3 layers of wool, and when she climbed down into the chamber, she looked at the stone wall and the lantern and the calm faces of the people already there, and she began to weep, not from sadness, but from the specific relief of a woman who had genuinely believed an hour ago that her children were going to die. And an elderly couple named Bruciad, who had been living alone on their claim since their adult son had taken work in Fargo the previous autumn, and who had spent the worst night of the January storm, sitting together in a single chair beside their stove, holding each other's hands, waiting for the wood to run out, and not knowing what would happen after that. The old man, whose name was Thomas, was 71 years old and had fought in the Civil War and had survived Antietam and the wilderness in the long cold winter at Petersburg. And he said later that the night of January 9th, 1887, in a sod house on the Dakota prairie with the wood running out, was the most frightened he had ever been in his life. Not because of the cold itself, but because his wife was with him and he could not protect her from it, and there was nothing he could do except hold her hand and wait. What happened after that was Maren Eriksson. At its peak occupancy, the chamber and the alcove together sheltered 16 people, and at various times at a dog, 4 hens, and 1 small pig that the Solberg woman had refused to leave behind on the grounds that the pig was not going to survive the night in the barn. She was correct. The pig would not have survived. The pig survived instead by spending 3 days in an underground chamber in Dakota territory, sleeping in the alcove next to a crate of hens in a structure designed by a Norwegian builder who had been dead for 5 years and constructed by his 63-year-old daughter with her own hands. The temperature held, the ventilation held. The thermal wall, which had been doing its slow and patient work since October of 1884, held. 16 people breathed the air that the ventilation shaft circulated. 16 people ate the provisions that Maren had stored. 16 people slept on the bare earth floor that radiated its warmth upward into their bodies, the way the earth radiates warmth into everything it holds steadily, without interruption, without asking anything in return. The chamber was crowded. There is no way to describe 16 people in a space designed for 4 without acknowledging that. The children slept in rows along the eastern wall, packed together like cordwood, their small bodies generating a collective warmth that Maren could feel from across the chamber. The adults sat with their backs against the walls and their legs drawn up to make room, shifting position every hour or so to keep their joints from stiffening, adjusting blankets, passing water, speaking in the low voices that people use in enclosed spaces where sound carries differently than it does above ground. The Bruciad couple sat together in the corner nearest the alcove, Thomas, with his arm around his wife's shoulders and her head resting against his coat, and they barely moved for the first 12 hours. They had come closer to dying than any of the others, and they knew it, and the knowledge had made them very still and very quiet and very grateful for the warmth of stone that had been absorbing heat from the earth for more than 2 years. The Solberg infant cried twice during the first night and then settled the way infants do when the temperature around them is steady and the bodies near them are warm and the vibrations of the earth beneath them are the oldest lullaby in the world. Henrik Solberg's pig, which had been carried down the ladder in a grain sack, spent the first hour investigating every corner of the alcove with its snout before settling down next to the hen crate and falling asleep with its head on its front hooves. The hens regarded the pig with the mild suspicion that hens regard everything, and then they too settled, and the alcove became a small underground farmyard that was warmer and calmer than any barn on the surface of Pembina County. Marin moved among them all with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has planned for this. She checked the ventilation. She managed the lantern. She distributed food in portions she had calculated days ago. She checked on the Bruciad couple every few hours, putting her hand on Thomas's wrist to feel his pulse, looking at the color of his wife's fingernails, satisfying herself that they were warming properly and that no lasting damage had been done. She did not sleep much during those 3 days. She dozed in short intervals, leaning against the thermal wall with one hand resting on the stone, feeling its warmth against her palm, and waking every hour or so to check the thermometer and listen to the breathing of the people around her and make the small adjustments that kept the system running. And at the center of it all, an oil lantern burned on a schedule that Marin maintained with the precision of a woman who has calculated exactly how many hours of light and heat she can afford and will not waste a single one. 2 hours on, 4 hours off, 2 hours on, 4 hours off. The rhythm of survival, which is not dramatic and not exciting, and not the kind of thing that makes for a stirring scene in a story, but which is in the end the thing that keeps people alive. Not heroism, not luck. Arithmetic. Marin Erickson was very good at arithmetic. In the final weeks of the hard winter, as the worst of the storms broke and the temperatures began their grudging retreat toward zero, and above the story of what Marin Erickson had built under her woodshed moved through the small community of Pembina County in the way that genuinely useful knowledge always moves when people have recently been frightened. Quickly, precisely, and with the specific gravity of something that will not be forgotten. Niels Bjerknes, when he described it to a group of men at the Grafton feed store in March of 1887, said that it was the most practical piece of building he had ever seen, that it had been designed and constructed by a woman of 63, working alone without help, without recognition, without any apparent acknowledgement of the difficulty of what she had undertaken, and that he intended to build one himself before the following autumn. The men at the feed store listened. Some of them nodded, some of them asked questions about the dimensions and the depth and the ventilation and the cost of materials and how long it had taken to build. None of them used the word lucky. That word had been retired from the vocabulary of everyone who had spent time in Marin Erickson's chamber during the hard winter, and it was not coming back. It had been replaced by other words, words like practical, words like capable, words like remarkable, words that should have been used 2 years earlier, but that no one had thought to apply to a 63-year-old widow on 47 acres of prairie, which he did. Niels Bjerknes built his own shelter before the following autumn with Marin's help. She walked his property with him in July and selected the location. She drew the cross-section for him on a piece of brown paper the way her father had drawn it for her, with measurements and notes in small arrows indicating the direction of airflow. She supervised the digging and the placement of the ceiling timbers and the construction of the trap door and the boring of the ventilation shaft. She showed him how to build the thermal flywheel and explained why the stones mattered and how long they needed to be in place before they would begin to do their work. And he paid her for that help. The first money she had ever earned from the knowledge her father had given her. Not a large sum, but enough to matter. Enough to mean that the thing Halvor Strand had carried in his head for 40 years and transferred to his daughter on a summer afternoon in a farmhouse outside St. Paul had become at last not just knowledge, but livelihood. Not just survival, but profession. Caldwell, the station agent at Grafton, who kept his meticulous daily journal of weather conditions and local events, wrote a 4-paragraph account of the underground shelter in his entry for February 22nd, 1887. He noted that it had provided warmth and safety for no fewer than 16 persons during the extreme conditions of January last, and that it had been designed and built by a Norwegian widow of 63 years, operating alone without assistance and without any apparent recognition from the surrounding community of the significance of what she had accomplished. That journal survived. It is held today and in the collections of the State Historical Society of North Dakota, cataloged under the general heading of Frontier Homesteader Accounts, in a box that also contains a seed catalog from 1889, a child's drawing of a horse, and 3 letters in Norwegian that have not yet been translated. It is possible that those letters were written by Halvor Strand. it is possible that they contain instructions for building something. No one has checked. The box sits on a shelf in a climate-controlled room in Bismarck, and the letters sit inside it, and the knowledge they may contain waits for someone who can read them. Whitfield the merchant came to see Marin in April of 1887. He did not come to collect on the debt. He came to ask whether she might be willing to build a similar structure on his property in Grafton, for which he would forgive the remaining balance and pay an additional sum. Marin looked at him across the counter of his own store. This man who had waited with the patience of a creditor for her to fail, who had walked across her trapdoor on an October afternoon and thought about nothing but the price of her land, and she told him she would consider it. She did not build one for Whitfield. She did not explain why. She simply let the offer sit where he had placed it and moved on with her business, which was paying off her debt through her own means on her own terms. There are things that money can buy, and there are things that must be earned in other ways, and Marin Erickson understood the difference between the two, even if Whitfield did not. She paid off the remaining $48 of the debt by the autumn of 1887. Partly from the sale of 2 calves she had raised from Sylve, and partly from the sum Niels Bjerknes paid her for the design and supervision of his own shelter. She owed nothing to anyone. The land was hers. It had always been hers, but now it was hers in the way that matters, which is to say no one could take it from her, and no one was waiting for her to let it go. She continued to work the claim for the next 22 years. She planted wheat in the spring and harvested it in the fall, and kept her animals alive through the winters, and maintained the chamber beneath the woodshed with the same steady attention she gave to everything else that mattered. She replaced the frost mortar every spring, kneeling at the edge of the trapdoor and lowering herself down the ladder with the careful deliberation of a woman whose knees had earned every ache they carried, and she inspected each joint and each timber and each stone with the thoroughness of a builder who understands that maintenance is not a lesser form of construction, but its continuation. She inspected the ceiling timbers every autumn, pressing her hand against each pole and feeling for the subtle give that would indicate rot or weakness, checking the notches where the poles rested against the subsoil walls, looking for signs of settling or erosion that might compromise the structure over time. She found problems twice in 22 years. Once in the spring of 1891, she discovered that one of the cottonwood poles had developed a soft spot near its center, where moisture had penetrated the bark. She replaced it in a single day, cutting a new pole from the same creek bed on the Bjerknes claim, hauling it back with Sylve's daughter, a cow she had named Halvora, after her father, and fitting it into the notches with the same precision she had used 7 years before. The second time in the autumn of 1895, she found that the earth above the ceiling had settled unevenly, creating a slight depression in the woodshed floor that might over time allow water to pool and seep through the straw layer. She corrected it in an afternoon, adding tamped earth and leveling the surface and spreading fresh wood chips over the repair. She added 3 more stones to the thermal wall over the years, bringing the total to 50, a number she found satisfying for reasons she did not bother to explain to anyone. The chamber was used 4 more times over those 22 years. Twice by Marin and the girls during particularly severe storms, and twice by neighbors who had learned through the quiet channels of frontier knowledge that there was a place on the Erickson claim where the cold could not reach. Marin never turned anyone away. She never asked for payment from those who came to her chamber in need. She simply opened the trapdoor and helped them down and closed it behind them and let the earth do what the earth does. She lived to be 85 years old. She died in the spring of 1906 in her bed in the sod house that Gunnar had built with Solveig, sitting beside her, and the brown paper drawings folded on the table within arm's reach. She had not looked at them in years. She did not need to. Everything on that paper was inside her, and everything inside her was now inside Solveig, and that was enough. That was the only form of immortality she had ever wanted. Solveig, who was 10 years old during the hard winter, learned everything her grandmother knew about the construction of underground shelters. She learned the principles and the practice, the theory and the technique, the way Marin had learned from Halvor, and Halvor had learned from Grayseth, and Grayseth had learned from the men who came before him. She learned it with her hands and her mind, and the particular seriousness of a child who understands that what she is receiving has been carried a very long way by people who paid a great deal to carry it. She taught the method to 2 other women in the community before her own marriage in 1897. One of them built a shelter that same winter. The other built one the following year. Neither shelter was tested by a winter as severe as the one of '86, but both were used and both held, and both women said afterward that the knowledge of having it there beneath their feet ready was worth more than the labor it had cost to build. The knowledge spread the way all durable knowledge spreads, not through books or lectures or institutions, through hands, through demonstration, through the quiet transfer from one person who has built a thing to another person who wants to learn. It is the oldest form of teaching in the world, and it is still, despite everything that has changed since 1887, the most reliable. A book can be lost, a lecture can be forgotten, but a person who has built something with their own hands and felt it work carries that knowledge in their body for the rest of their life, and they can transfer it to another body, another pair of hands, another mind that is willing to receive it. That is what Halvor Strand did for Maren. That is what Maren did for Solveig. That is what Solveig did for the two women she taught, and what those women did for the people they taught after them. An unbroken chain, hand to hand, mind to mind, generation to generation. From the Gudbrandsdalen Valley to the Dakota Prairie, from the old Norwegian stabber builders to a 10-year-old girl holding two eggs in a chamber, 8 feet underground while the worst winter in the history of the Northern Plains raged above her. Britta, who had once cried for 40 minutes in the chamber and then fallen asleep on the warm earth floor for 11 hours, became in later life a school teacher in the town of Park River, 30 miles to the southwest. She taught reading and arithmetic and penmanship to children who came to school in wool coats and muddy boots and who sat in rows in a room heated by a cast-iron stove that she fed every morning before the first student arrived. She was a good teacher. She was patient and precise, and she had the particular gift of explaining difficult things simply, which is a gift that she may have inherited from a grandmother who had once explained the Venturi effect to a 10-year-old using a candle and a 4-inch shaft bored through clay at a 45-degree angle. She had her grandmother's hands broad and capable, and her grandmother's way of standing at the front of the room with her weight balanced evenly on both feet and her eyes moving across the faces of her students with the calm attention of a woman who is measuring what each of them needs and calculating how to provide it. And occasionally on particularly cold January days when the wind came across the prairie with the sound that she had never forgotten, and that still after all the years made something tighten in her chest, she told her students the story. The story of the winter her grandmother kept 16 people warm underground while the temperature above held at minus 38 degrees for 3 days. She told it simply. She told it without exaggeration, without drama, without the kind of embellishment that people sometimes add to stories to make them seem more important than they are. She did not need to. The facts were sufficient. The numbers spoke for themselves. An 8-foot chamber, 47 riverstones, 54 degrees when the surface was minus 28, 61 degrees when 16 bodies were resting in the enclosed space, 2 eggs on the second morning. The children listened the way children always listen to true stories, which is differently from the way they listen to invented ones. They listened with their bodies as well as their ears, leaning forward slightly in their seats, their hands still on their desks, their eyes on Britta's face absorbing not just the facts but the weight of them. The understanding that this was a thing that had actually happened in a place that was not so far from where they sat, to a woman who had been real. Britta always ended the story the same way. Not with the numbers, not with the engineering, not with the dimensions of the chamber or the temperature readings or the principles of thermal mass and convection. She ended it with a single detail that she said had stayed with her for 60 years. The image of an oil lantern burning steadily in an 8-foot deep chamber beneath a forgotten woodshed on the northern plains. 16 people sitting around it who had nowhere else to go, and the flame not flickering. Not once, not even when the worst of it came. Because the earth, if you are willing to go deep enough, does not shake. And a woman who knows that and who builds accordingly does not need permission from the cold.